the domestic front lines of cleanliness. When you step quietly into a Victorian parlor, if you are somehow transported back to the mid-19th century, you might notice a peculiar scent that clings to every surface. It is not the smell of fresh flowers or the sharp tang of coal smoke from outside. Instead, it is soft, warm, and faintly sweet. This is the scent of beeswax, the unsung hero of middle-class domestic life in Victorian Britain. Before we unravel why these rooms carried that aroma, we must first step into the rhythms of everyday domestic work during this time. Victorian parlors were not only spaces of display, they were also battlegrounds where housewives and servants fought an unending war against dust and grime. England, particularly during its industrial boom, was not a clean place. Coal-powered machinery belched soot into the sky, and gas lamps left residues on walls and furniture. Even in smaller towns, dust from streets and horse-drawn carriages crept in through every crack in the window. Maintaining a parlor, an area where guests would be received and judgments about respectability quietly made, required a meticulous daily routine. Furniture, often made of mahogany or walnut, absorbed this environmental filth. To protect it, Victorian homemakers used beeswax polish. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly convenient, but it was essential. This golden substance, derived from honeycombs, was laboriously collected by beekeepers who had yet to benefit from modern extraction tools. The wax was then melted, filtered, and combined with turpentine or linseed oil to create a paste that clung to wooden surfaces. Every morning, before the master of the house descended for breakfast, a servant, or in less affluent homes, the housewife herself, would begin the polishing ritual. The process was slow and deliberate. A cloth was dipped into the wax mixture, and long, even strokes were applied to tables, chairs, and sideboards. The aim wasn't merely to shine, but to build a protective barrier against dust and moisture. Over time, layers of wax accumulated, creating a warm luster that reflected candlelight in a gentle, almost sleepy glow. This polishing ritual was both physically demanding and oddly meditative. The worker bent low over surfaces, repeating the same movements for hours, their arms aching yet steady. The smell of beeswax mingled with the faint pine scent of turpentine, filling the room. It was a quiet task, rarely noticed by visitors, unless the job was neglected. In a way, the smell itself became a sign of diligence, a proof that someone in the household cared enough to spend hours ensuring every surface was immaculate. But beeswax did more than simply protect furniture. It was also used on wooden floors, ace boards, and even leather-bound books. Victorian homes lacked our modern cleaning agents. Everything relied on natural substances and manual labor. When a young girl learned housekeeping from her mother, one of the first skills taught was how to properly polish wood without leaving streaks or clumps. A poorly waxed chair, was a small domestic shame, a hint of incompetence that neighbors might quietly note. The obsession with cleanliness in this era had roots deeper than simple vanity. Industrial pollution was not fully understood, but people sensed its effects. Thick soot clung to windowsills. Wallpaper yellowed faster than before. There was a cultural fear that filth bred disease, a fear that preceded germ theory, but shaped behaviors nonetheless. To fight back, households adopted rigorous cleaning practices. Polishing furniture wasn't just aesthetic. It was thought to protect health by reducing lingering dust. And then there was status. The middle class, expanding rapidly thanks to industrial growth, sought ways to demonstrate refinement. Parlors were central to this performance. Guests would be seated there, offered tea, and allowed to scan the room's decor. A gleaming table hinted at stability and good breeding. For women especially, success in maintaining a spotless home translated into quiet social victories. Beeswax, humble as it was, lay at the heart of this performance. Unlike varnishes or shellacs, it did not drastically alter the wood's color or texture. It preserved furniture as it was meant to be seen. And unlike synthetic polishes that would appear later in the 20th century, beeswax left behind a faint, organic fragrance, a smell that whispered of care and continuity, rather than chemical intervention. Ah, noble traveler, heed my words, and I shall lead thee to the fabled Holeful Bakery. Step forth upon West 74th Street, marching straight with purpose. When thou dost reach the great crossing at Columbus Avenue, turn left, as if answering the call to adventure. Continue southward, past bustling merchants and townfolk, until thou dost arrive at Amsterdam Avenue. Here, turn right, for the scent of warm-baked glory draws near. Lo, just ahead, the crest of Levain Bakery stands proud. Enter, noble traveler, and claim thy rightful reward, a golden, gooey treasure beyond measure. Go forth, and may thy quest be delicious and true. Despite its quiet importance, beeswax polishing was tedious. A single large cabinet could take an hour or more to wax properly. The wax itself had to be softened over heat, stirred until smooth, and carefully stored to prevent hardening. Servants carried it in small tins from one room to another, sometimes kneeling on padded cloths to reach lower panels. The repetitive sound of cloth against wood became part of the household's background music, alongside ticking clocks and distant street noises. Interestingly, the process also bound households to rural economies. Beekeeping was largely a countryside trade, and urban households depended on small-scale beekeepers for their supply. Rural women often prepared beeswax pastes and sold them in town markets or through door-to-door peddlers. Thus, the smell of beeswax in a city parlor carried with it a quiet echo of hedgerows and buzzing hives miles away. As you imagine standing in such a room, you might notice more than the smell. The surfaces feel slightly tacky to the touch, gripping your fingertips before releasing. The sheen is soft, not glossy, reflecting light in muted halos. Every polished piece tells the story of hours spent in quiet repetition. The work is invisible, but its traces, scent, touch, luster, linger in every corner. Yet this was only the beginning of beeswax's role in Victorian domestic life. Beyond the daily routines and social signals, it connected to deeper, slower-moving changes in household labor and even gender roles. Why did beeswax, of all substances, come to define the look and smell of respectability? What forces transformed a simple hive product into a symbol of middle-class diligence? Social identity, domestic labor, and the industrial shift. If you could linger in that faintly beeswax-scented parlor long enough to watch the day unfold, you would begin to see how deeply this seemingly mundane ritual tied itself to social identity. The act of polishing furniture and the very choice of beeswax over other substances were not random quirks of housekeeping. They were markers of class, gender, and evolving domestic economies. To understand Victorian life, you must imagine not just the polished wood, but also the hands that labored over it and the silent messages it conveyed to every guest who crossed the threshold. The gendered nature of beeswax polishing in Victorian Britain, the home was considered the moral nucleus of society, with women as its custodians. While men were expected to earn and navigate the public sphere, women were tasked with cultivating the private realm of domestic order. Maintaining furniture with beeswax was emblematic of this role. Manuals of the time, such as Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in 1861, devoted entire sections to cleaning and polishing methods, underscoring their importance in running a proper home. Even when households had servants, the lady of the house bore ultimate responsibility for domestic standards. A poorly maintained parlor reflected badly not on the servant alone, but on the mistress's moral and managerial competence. It was believed that a well-waxed table and spotless skirting boards hinted at spiritual cleanliness, a concept tightly interwoven with Victorian Christian values. Servants themselves, often young women from rural areas seeking wages in the city, were the true executors of this labor. They worked long hours, rising before dawn to heat water, stoke fires, scrub, polish, and dust until late evening. The beeswax ritual was part of a larger regimen that left little room for rest. Yet, it was invisible labor. Guests rarely saw a servant unless she brought tea or answered the door. The shine on a chair or the subtle scent in the air stood as silent testimony to her hours of work. One can imagine the aching hands of a maidservant, the wax clinging under her fingernails, the repetitive motions dulling her shoulders. Despite this, pride existed in well-done work. Servants could measure their own competence by the softness of a luster, by how long dust stayed at bay, or by how guests. However, owning mahogany furniture alone was not enough to signal refinement. Proper maintenance, achieved through beeswax polishing, became essential to emulate upper-class standards. A home's appearance spoke volumes about its inhabitants. To visitors, a dull, neglected cabinet hinted at financial instability or moral laxity. Conversely, a warm, waxy sheen implied self-discipline, stability, and aspirational gentility. Interestingly, this drive for respectability filtered into urban development itself. Victorian houses were designed with prominent parlors near the front door, making them the stage for such displays. A visitor's first impression formed not from the kitchen or bedroom, but from this meticulously waxed and arranged reception room. From furniture placement to the faint aroma of beeswax, every detail participated in this silent dialogue of class. For working-class families, beeswax remained largely out of reach. They used cheaper substitutes, such as black lead for grates, or homemade polishes made from soot and lard. The difference was perceptible. Synthetic or improvised polishes lacked beeswax's durability and subtle fragrance. Middle-class homes thus carried not only a visual sheen, but also a distinct olfactory identity that reinforced social divides. The industrialization of household maintenance. While beeswax polishing seemed timeless and traditional, the late Victorian period saw significant industrial changes to how households accessed and used cleaning products. Earlier in the century, beeswax pastes were handmade either in kitchens or by rural vendors who supplied towns. By the 1870s and 1880s, however, commercial polish manufacturers began standardizing production. Companies packaged beeswax-based polishes in branded tins, advertising them in newspapers and department stores. This commercialization subtly shifted domestic labor. Pre-made polish saved households time in preparation, but it also expanded the scale of polishing expected. Instructions on tins encouraged weekly or even daily application on more surfaces, from wainscoting to picture frames. The very presence of store-bought wax reinforced that constant cleanliness was achievable and thus expected. Moreover, industrialization introduced synthetic alternatives. Paraffin-based polishes, derived from petroleum, entered the market by the late 19th century. They promised faster results and higher shine than traditional beeswax. Yet many middle-class homemakers resisted these innovations, viewing them as too artificial, lacking the natural warmth beeswax imparted. Authenticity became part of the social signaling embedded in a polished surface. The role of servants also evolved. As middle-class women increasingly took on direct household management, especially in smaller homes with fewer servants, manual waxing became a skill they themselves had to perform. This blurred class lines. In striving for genteel appearances, mistresses sometimes endured the same physical drudgery, once relegated to hired help. Invisible networks behind the beeswax. Every dab of wax on a Victorian sideboard carried with it an unseen network of production and trade. Beekeepers, often operating in the countryside, supplied wax harvested from hives maintained through meticulous seasonal labor. Honey and wax markets connected rural villages to urban centers, ensuring a steady flow of raw material to households. Complemented a room's immaculate appearance. For some, skillful polishing was a route to promotion within the household, from scullery maid to housemaid, perhaps even to lady's maid, a coveted post with fewer menial duties. Beeswax as a marker of middle-class identity during the Victorian era. Britain's middle class expanded rapidly due to industrialization, creating new social dynamics. Previously, polished wooden furniture was a hallmark of aristocratic estates, where armies of servants maintained grand halls and parlors. With newfound wealth, middle-class families could now purchase fine furniture made possible by advances in mass production and carpentry. A persistent ritual in an age of progress. As the 19th century progressed, Britain transformed through railways, telegraphs, and industrial might. Yet inside the domestic sphere, time seemed to stand still. The ritual of beeswax polishing remained stubbornly manual and repetitive, a counterpoint to the era's fascination with mechanization. One might imagine a maid, after hours of laboring with wax and cloth, glancing out a window to see smoke rising from a nearby factory, or the trail of a steam locomotive in the distance. Outside, machines revolutionized production. Inside, tradition reigned. To polish wood effectively, no device could replace human touch. Even as early vacuum cleaners appeared in the late 1800s and new cleaning chemicals entered homes, beeswax held its place. It endured because it did more than clean. It symbolized patience, stability, and care, qualities machines could not replicate. But this persistence carried tension. As women advocated for education and suffrage, critics began questioning the endless domestic toil demanded of them. Writers and reformers asked whether polishing tables for hours each week was truly virtuous or merely a relic of outdated ideals. The parlor still smelled faintly of beeswax, but under that scent lay the stirrings of change. Domestic routines that had defined social identity for decades were beginning to feel burdensome. The very wax that signified refinement now hinted at constraint. The decline of beeswax and its lingering legacy. By the end of the 19th century, as Victorian society edged toward the dawn of a new century, the faint beeswax scent that had defined parlors for decades began to fade. The ritual that once anchored domestic life was now quietly challenged by new technologies, changing social attitudes, and a growing desire for efficiency. The story of beeswax did not end abruptly, but rather dwindled gradually, leaving behind a subtle imprint on how we think about cleanliness and domestic pride even today. Emerging cleaning innovations. As the Industrial Revolution matured, manufacturers introduced new cleaning solutions and tools designed to save time and labor. Synthetic furniture polishes began to appear in advertisements by the 1890s, boasting claims of no offing required and instant shine. These products were often petroleum-based, derived from paraffin or mineral oils, making them cheaper and faster to apply than traditional beeswax mixture. Meanwhile, furniture design itself evolved. The dark, heavy woods of mid-Victorian interiors gave way to lighter finishes and simpler lines as the arts and crafts movement and later Art Nouveau influenced home decor. These new styles often required different maintenance techniques, further diminishing beeswax's role as the universal solution for furniture care. For many households, particularly in burgeoning urban centers, time was increasingly precious. Middle-class women who once relied on full staffs of servants now managed homes with fewer helping hands due to rising wages and shifting labor markets. The luxury of spending hours polishing wood gave way to the practicality of spray polishes and dusters. The changing role of servants and domestic labor. The social structure that had supported labor-intensive beeswax polishing began to erode. As the century turned, many domestic servants left household service for industrial jobs offering higher pay and shorter hours. This created what contemporaries called the servant problem. Middle-class families struggled to find and retain domestic help. In response, homemakers had to adapt. Instruction manuals from the early 20th century, such as those by the Home and Colonial School Society, taught women how to manage homes without a large staff. These guides increasingly recommended modern cleaning products designed for quick application. Beeswax remained mentioned, but more as a traditional option than the expected standard it had once been. Additionally, changing cultural norms redefined what it meant to be a good homemaker. Efficiency, hygiene, and scientific management of the home became buzzwords. Influenced by thinkers like Catherine Beecher and later Christine Frederick, women embraced principles of home economics, which prioritized labor-saving methods over older, painstaking rituals. Furniture manufacturing and industrial polishing. Industrial advances also transformed furniture production. Factories began mass-producing pieces with varnished or lacquered finishes that provided durable protection straight from the workshop. Unlike raw wood requiring layers of beeswax, these pre-finished surfaces resisted dust and staining with minimal upkeep. Retailers advertised these innovations as modern housekeeping made easy, appealing to the growing number of families balancing domestic duties with the demands of industrial urban life. The notion of polishing furniture weekly or even monthly began to seem old-fashioned. Interestingly, manufacturers still used beeswax, just not in the home. In factory settings, beeswax-based sealants were applied during production to create polished finishes without requiring future maintenance. Consumers unknowingly benefited from beeswax's protective qualities, though the intimate, laborious act of applying it personally was no longer necessary. Lingering in rural homes and old habits, despite its decline in cities, beeswax polishing persisted in rural households well into the 20th century. These homes often lacked access to modern cleaning products or mass-produced lacquered furniture. Families continued making their own polishes, melting wax over wood stoves and mixing it with linseed oil, just as their grandparents had. For these households, polishing furniture remained more than just cleaning. It was tradition. The scent of warmed beeswax and turpentine evoked stability and continuity, linking generations through shared domestic practices. Some rural homemakers even resisted modern products, viewing them as inferior or overly chemical compared to natural beeswax. Even in cities, certain heirloom pieces, grandfather clocks, antique cabinets, or ornate tables demanded beeswax care to preserve their aged wood. In these cases, beeswax became less a tool of everyday maintenance and more a niche craft for preserving history. Cultural memory of beeswax. Though largely absent from modern housekeeping routines, the memory of beeswax polishing lingers in literature, museum exhibits, and even in language. Writers of the early 20th century, reminiscing about Victorian childhoods, often described the smell of beeswax as synonymous with home, safety, and maternal care. Museums dedicated to Victorian domestic life carefully replicate this scent in period rooms, understanding that smell carries history as powerfully as visual artifacts. Heritage homes today still rely on traditional beeswax pastes to maintain authenticity, ensuring that visitors can experience the same soft sheen and aroma once common in parlors across Britain. In modern furniture care, beeswax has re-emerged as a specialty product marketed for its natural, eco-friendly properties. Boutique manufacturers sell handcrafted beeswax polishes to customers seeking traditional finishes for high-quality wooden furniture. What was once a symbol of daily toil is now a mark of artisanal craftsmanship and heritage preservation. Beeswax as symbol and survival strategy. Ultimately, beeswax polishing was more than an old cleaning habit. It symbolized resilience, patience, and human ingenuity in adapting to an increasingly industrial world. In a time when pollution, soot, and dust invaded every crevice, beeswax offered a means to preserve beauty and functionality in the home. The process demanded quiet dedication, a willingness to work slowly and repetitively, often without acknowledgement. This patience mirrored broader survival strategies of the Victorian middle class, navigating social pressures, maintaining appearances, and managing households through sheer diligence. Even as technological progress rendered the ritual obsolete, its imprint remained. Modern housekeeping with its quick sprays and wipes still echoes the Victorian belief that domestic order reflects moral character. The pursuit of a clean, polished home, whether achieved with beeswax or synthetic polish, traces its roots back to those faintly scented parlors. As you imagine leaving that 19th century room for the last time, the scent of beeswax lingers lightly on your sleeve. It is not overpowering, not meant to dazzle or impress, but simply to reassure. A quiet testament to countless hours of unseen labor, to the intertwining of rural hives and urban respectability, to a time when survival and status alike depended on the shine of wood beneath one's fingertips. The ritual may have faded, yet its whisper remains in every polished surface that seeks to say, "This is a place of care." The endless ledger, bookkeeping in the Hanseatic League, the birth of merchant records and the silent keepers of trade. You sit quietly in a low-beamed room, candlelight spilling across a long wooden table. There is no sound but the faint scratching of a quill on parchment, and the occasional creak of old leather boots shifting on floorboards. The room smells of ink, beeswax, and sea salt drifting in from the nearby port. This is Lübeck, sometime in the 14th century, the bustling heart of the Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant guilds and market towns, dominating trade in Northern Europe for centuries. But we will not focus on the grand deals struck between wealthy merchants, or the tall cogs and hulks that carry timber, fish, and furs across the Baltic and North Seas. Instead, we descend into the quiet, meticulous world of the bookkeepers, the unsung men who recorded every sack of grain, every barrel of salted herring, every silver coin exchanged between distant ports. Without them, the League's mighty trade network would have collapsed into chaos. A merchant's silent shadow. Imagine a successful Hanseatic merchant, rich, commanding fleets of ships, negotiating with foreign kings. Behind him, in the shadows of counting houses, sits a quieter figure, the bookkeeper. Often poorly dressed compared to their employers, these men labored in dim rooms filled with ledgers stacked like bricks against the walls. Their tools were simple yet vital. Quills cut from goose feathers, ink made from oak galls and iron salts, wax seals to authenticate documents. Paper, an expensive commodity imported from Italy, was used sparingly. Parchment remained common. Every transaction had to be carefully copied into ledgers, often in multiple books. This slow, repetitive work required sharp memory and keen observation. Bookkeepers tracked not just numbers, but tides, ship schedules, and changing tolls at distant ports. They calculated the risks of storms in the Skagerrak, piracy off Gotland, or fluctuating grain prices in Novgorod. Each quill stroke tied one part of the League's vast network to another. The Hanseatic network and the need for order. The Hanseatic League was not a single nation, but a web of alliances stretching from London to Riga, Bergen to Bruges. Merchant guilds cooperated to protect their mutual interests, building fortified warehouses and negotiating privileges with local rulers. But this cooperation depended on trust, and trust required records. Trust. When ships left Lübeck carrying herring to Danzig, furs to Bruges, or wax to Bergen, every detail had to be written down. Ship's name, captain, cargo weight, port fees paid, expected profit margins. These were not casual notes. They were legally binding documents used in disputes and court claims. Without such bookkeeping, trade agreements between cities separated by hundreds of miles would have been impossible to enforce. Ledgers also connected generations. A merchant might die or retire, but his records allowed heirs to understand debts owed and investments pending. In many families, bookkeeping was a legacy, with sons trained to continue the art of balancing accounts and preserving their family's place in the league. Inside the counting house, step closer to the candlelit table. The bookkeeper dips his quill and scratches across parchment in a script you can barely read. The writing is dense, cramped to conserve space, and filled with abbreviations only insiders understood. Columns of numbers, marks indicating types of goods, notations for exchange rates. It is a silent language of trade. On one shelf rests a balance scale for weighing coins and goods. Nearby, a locked chest holds wax seals, keys to warehouses, and copies of contracts. Maps of the Baltic coast hang on walls, corners curling from sea dampness. There is little decoration. This is a room for labor, not comfort. The day begins at dawn, often long before the merchant arrives. Letters from other cities must be read aloud and copied into correspondence logs. Ship manifests are checked against warehouse inventories. Payments to guild funds or city taxes are meticulously recorded. When the merchant finally enters, he consults these recs to make decisions, relying entirely on the accuracy of his silent clerk. Errors, though rare, brought harsh consequences. A misplaced number could mean underpaid tolls or miscounted cargo. Rival merchants, always alert for weaknesses, might use discrepancies to challenge deals or undermine reputations. Thus, the bookkeeper worked under constant pressure, his livelihood bound to precision. The tools of accuracy bookkeeping in the Hanseatic League relied on consistency. Wooden counting boards, an early form of abacus, helped calculate sums before they were inked into ledgers. Tallies were cut into sticks for informal trade records, split lengthwise so both buyer and seller had a matching half as proof. Seals authenticated documents pressed into wax with engraved metal stamps unique to each merchant or guild. These seals prevented forgery and established legitimacy across distant cities. A merchant in London could present a sealed ledger page from Lübeck as proof of agreed trade, trusted because no one could easily duplicate the intricate marks. Even time was carefully tracked. Though mechanical clocks were rare, bookkeepers used water clocks, candles marked with time divisions, or simply the position of the sun to measure work hours and deadlines for shipments. Personal lives of bookkeepers. Despite their importance, bookkeepers rarely achieved wealth or fame. Most lived modestly above counting houses or in cramped city dwellings. Their social status hovered between common laborers and the merchant elite, educated enough to manage complex records, yet dependent on their employers' fortunes. Training was often informal. Young apprentices learned under older clerks, copying ledgers until their handwriting and calculation skills were flawless. Some attended schools sponsored by guilds, where they studied arithmetic, languages, and trade law. A skilled bookkeeper who mastered multiple tongues, German, Dutch, Latin, could serve merchants dealing across regions, earning slightly higher wages. Family life was modest. Bookkeepers married within their class. Their wives often managing household expenses with the same frugality their husbands showed in business. Leisure was rare. Evenings were spent reviewing ledgers or copying records by lamplight. Yet many found quiet pride in their craft. They were unseen architects of prosperity, ensuring ships launched with balanced accounts and merchants avoided ruinous debts. The endless nature of the ledger, unlike the journeys of ships or seasonal markets, the work of bookkeeping never ceased. When a fleet returned from Bergen, laden with dried fish, new calculations began for storage, taxation, and redistribution. Payments to sailors, bribes to port officials, and shares to investors all required meticulous recording. Even holidays offered little respite. Guild regulations mandated bookkeeping during festivals to ensure fairness in collective expenses. A single missed entry could disrupt profit sharing among merchants, sparking disputes that damaged guild unity. Thus, bookkeepers worked in cycles that stretched endlessly. As long as trade flowed, ledgers filled page after page, bound together in volumes that lined counting house shelves, like chronicles of unseen voyages. Some ledgers grew so large they spanned decades. Yellowed pages tracing the rise and fall of fortunes, long after the people involved had passed away. The quiet power of written records. Though silent and uncelebrated, bookkeeping held immense power. In legal disputes, ledgers determined outcomes more than testimony. Courts trusted the inked lines over spoken words, knowing merchants could not easily fabricate years of detailed entries. Guild councils relied on collective bookkeeping to negotiate privileges with rulers. Tax exemptions, harbor rights, and trade monopolies were defended with ledgers, proving a city's long-standing contributions to commerce. Even monarchs recognized this quiet power, granting Hanseatic cities unusual autonomy because their trade records showed unmatched efficiency in managing wealth. In essence, the League's dominance rested not on swords or cannons, but on ink, parchment, and the unbroken labor of men hunched over tables in dimly lit rooms. As you watch the bookkeeper pause to sand a fresh page, preventing the ink from smudging, you might wonder, how did these silent clerks shape the League's expansion beyond the Baltic, influencing trade routes and economic power across Europe? Evolution of Hanseatic bookkeeping and the shaping of European trade. The candle has burned lower in the counting house. Its wax pools quietly, the flame leaning as a draft sneaks in from the nearby harbor. Outside, sails flap, ropes creak, and distant merchants haggle in a mix of Low German, Danish, and Dutch. Inside, the bookkeeper sits steadfast, quill poised. as if time has slowed. This quiet room is more than a place of arithmetic. It is where European trade is silently bound together, transaction by transaction, through a complex web of written trust. Double entry, the quiet revolution. In the early centuries of Hanseatic dominance, bookkeeping was a linear affair. Transactions recorded as lists of credits and debits, often with sparse explanation. But as trade networks widened and cargoes became more diverse, this system strained under the weight of complexity. By the late 14th century, some Hanseatic merchants, inspired by Italian city-states like Venice and Florence, began adopting a new method: double-entry bookkeeping. Instead of merely listing payments and receipts, each transaction was entered twice, once as a credit, once as a debit, balancing every exchange and revealing profit or loss more clearly. This innovation spread gradually, carried along trade routes as merchants from Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen dealt with Mediterranean partners. But implementing it was no simple matter. Bookkeepers had to learn entirely new ways of structuring ledgers, using multiple columns and cross-referencing accounts. Mistakes could undo the benefits of this system, leading many conservative traders to cling to traditional single-entry methods well into the 15th century. Yet over time, double entry reshaped the league's financial landscape. Investors could now track shares in multiple voyages simultaneously. Guilds managed collective funds with unprecedented transparency. Even distant outposts, from Bergen to Novgorod, relied on these balanced books to maintain trust across oceans and political borders. International law and the authority of records. As the League expanded, disputes inevitably arose. Ships wrecked in foreign harbors, pirates seized cargoes, or partners defaulted on loans. Resolving these conflicts required more than verbal testimony. Courts demanded written proof. Bookkeepers became de facto legal authorities. Their ledgers served as binding evidence in maritime courts, from London to Riga. A single entry showing a barrel of wax sold in Reval could secure a merchant's claim against a dishonest broker in Bruges. Contracts, notarized and sealed, were backed by ledger copies sent to guild offices in multiple cities to prevent tampering. Guild assemblies, known as Hansetag, used these meticulous records to negotiate with kings and dukes. When arguing for toll exemptions or exclusive market rights, they presented decades of trade logs proving consistent economic contributions. These documents impressed even skeptical rulers who recognized that the Hanseatic League managed wealth more efficiently than many feudal states. In this way, bookkeeping transcended mere account management. It became the invisible scaffolding of international law, enabling cooperation across linguistic, cultural, and political divides long before modern nation-states emerged. Currency, exchange rates, and quiet innovation. Trade across Northern Europe required navigating a maze of currencies. Silver marks in Lübeck, sterling in London, florins in Bruges, and countless local coins in smaller ports. Exchange rates fluctuated constantly due to silver purity, political unrest, or shifting demand for certain goods. Bookkeepers kept careful tables of these conversions, updating them with news carried by sailors or letters from inland cities. Some clerks developed rudimentary financial instruments, bills of exchange, early forms of credit, allowing merchants to settle debts in one city without physically transporting coins. These notes, inscribed in ledgers and sealed, could be redeemed hundreds of miles away, reducing risks of theft or shipwreck losses. Managing these systems required extraordinary mental agility. A single shipment might involve loans from multiple investors, payments in several currencies, and profit sharing across different ventures. Without standardized national banks, bookkeeping filled the void, ensuring commerce flowed smoothly despite monetary chaos. Communication networks, the pulse of trade. Numbers alone could not sustain the league. Communication was its lifeblood, and bookkeepers orchestrated this flow of information. Letters crisscrossed Europe, carried by ship captains or mounted couriers. These were not casual notes, but carefully worded reports detailing cargo conditions, harbor fees, and competitor activities. Upon arrival, bookkeepers copied these letters into correspondence registers, creating archives of trade intelligence spanning decades. Some counting houses maintained elaborate filing systems with coded references for each port and partner merchant. From these records, traders could trace supply routes for timber from Scandinavia, salt from Lüneburg, or cloth from Flanders. This institutional memory allowed merchants to anticipate shortages, capitalize on surpluses, and outmaneuver rivals in distant markets. In larger Hanseatic cities, guild halls stored collective records of trade privileges, toll agreements, and foreign treaties. These archives, maintained by guild scribes and bookkeepers, ensured that even if a single merchant failed, the league as a whole retained the knowledge. Press claims or defend rights abroad. Quiet risks and silent scandals. Behind the facade of reliability, bookkeeping carried hidden dangers. Falsified ledgers occasionally surfaced, masking debts or exaggerating profits. When exposed, these scandals rocked guild trust, sometimes leading to expulsions or lifelong bans from trade. Other risks were more mundane, but equally devastating. Fire posed a constant threat to wooden counting houses. A single blaze could destroy years of records, erasing proof of ownership and plunging families into financial ruin. To mitigate this, some merchants stored duplicate ledgers in distant offices or in stone guild halls less vulnerable to flames. In cities like Hamburg, specialized notaries emerged to cross-verify ledgers, stamping pages to confirm accuracy. These notaries became early forms of auditors, their quiet inspections crucial to maintaining collective trust in a fragile but sprawling trade network. Social climbing and the path to wealth. Though rarely celebrated, skilled bookkeepers sometimes rose to prominence. A clever clerk who navigated complex transactions might be offered partnership in a merchant's ventures, gradually ascending to full guild membership. Such upward mobility was rare, but not impossible, creating a silent incentive for apprentices to master every nuance of ledger management. Conversely, wealthy merchants often placed sons in bookkeeping apprenticeships to ground them in trade fundamentals. These young men learned humility in the counting house, their soft hands blistered by hours of copying manifests and balancing double-entry columns. Only after proving competence in this quiet labor could they command fleets or negotiate with foreign powers. In this way, bookkeeping bridged classes, a discipline shared by modest clerks and ambitious patricians alike, uniting them in the slow craft of managing risk and sustaining trust. a growing legacy. By the 15th century, Hanseatic bookkeeping practices spread beyond Northern Europe. Dutch merchants refined double-entry methods. English traders adopted Hanseatic-style ledgers, and even Italian financiers incorporated Baltic innovations for long-distance sea trade. The silent clerks of Lübeck, Riga, and Hamburg had unknowingly shaped modern commerce. Their ink-stained pages carried seeds of global capitalism, systems of credit, legal enforcement of contracts, and techniques for managing multinational investments, centuries before the term multinational corporation existed. And yet, life in the counting house changed little. The same dim candlelight, the same cramped writing, the same relentless cycle of weighing coins, copying manifests, and cross-referencing accounts endured year after year. The bookkeeper's world remained narrow, even as its impact widened across continents. As you watch this quiet revolution unfold, you might wonder, how did bookkeeping evolve further as the League declined? And how did these silent practices lay the groundwork for modern banking and accounting long after Hanseatic ships vanished from the seas? Decline, transformation, and the lasting legacy of Hanseatic bookkeeping. The flame in the counting house hath burned low, leaving the ledger's inked lines to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Outside, the harbor no longer brims with as many sails as it once did. The mighty Hanseatic League, once the unchallenged master of Northern European trade, is slowly unraveling. Yet while the League's ships fade from the seas, its bookkeepers continue their work, unwittingly carrying forward practices that will outlive the Confederation itself. The waning power of the Hanseatic League. By the 16th century, the League's dominance faced mounting challenges. The rise of powerful nation-states, such as Denmark, Sweden, and Poland-Lithuania, brought increased taxation and military pressure on Hanseatic ports. The emergence of Dutch and English merchant fleets introduced fierce competition. Equipped with more advanced navigational techniques and state-backed trade policies, these changes disrupted centuries-old trade routes. Grain once flowing steadily from the Baltic to Western Europe found new channels through Amsterdam. English wool merchants bypassed Hanseatic brokers, sailing directly to continental buyers. The League's once mighty convoys dwindled, and with them, the centralized power of guild-led trade. But within counting houses, life seemed unchanged. Bookkeepers still dipped quills into ink, balanced double-entry columns, and filed manifests in neat stacks. Yet the work grew more precarious. Trade volumes decreased, debts mounted, and long-standing privileges in foreign ports were stripped away. Ledgers that once recorded expansion now documented contraction, a slow bleed of influence recorded in silent arithmetic. The evolution of ledgers in decline. Paradoxically, as the League weakened, its bookkeeping practices grew more sophisticated. To survive shrinking profit margins, merchants relied on increasingly detailed accounting. Ledgers expanded into multi-volume series, tracking not only cargo and payments, but also insurance policies, shipping consortium agreements, and speculative investments in emerging markets like the Iberian spice trade. Some bookkeepers began using early printed forms, blank accounting pages produced by printing presses, to standardize entries and reduce errors. Guild councils mandated stricter audits, sending inspectors to verify that struggling merchants kept transparent records. These audits foreshadowed modern financial regulations, born out of necessity as the League fought to maintain credibility in a rapidly changing economic landscape. Even as Hanseatic influence waned politically, its bookkeepers unintentionally contributed to a quiet financial revolution. Their methods were copied by Dutch trading companies and English chartered firms, spreading far beyond the Baltic and North Seas, shifting centers of trade and knowledge. By the 17th century, Dutch cities like Amsterdam became new hubs of maritime commerce. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, founded in 1602, operated on a scale the Hanseatic League had never achieved, spanning continents and managing fleets of unprecedented size. But the VOC's administrative backbone was not born in isolation. Many of its early clerks had trained in Hanseatic counting houses or learned from ledgers originating in Lübeck or Hamburg. Double-entry bookkeeping, meticulous cargo manifests, and techniques for tracking complex shareholder investments all bore Hanseatic fingerprints. Similarly, the Bank of Amsterdam, 1609, introduced centralized deposit and transfer systems that echoed the decentralized credit networks of Hanseatic merchants, while the League itself faded into a relic of medieval commerce. Its quiet accounting traditions became foundational to modern capitalism. Personal fates of the bookkeepers. As the League declined, so too did opportunities for its bookkeepers. Once secure positions became unstable as guilds dissolved and merchants closed their counting houses. Some clerks shifted into municipal roles, managing city treasuries or working for emerging national governments that needed trained record keepers for taxation and state finances. Others migrated westward, finding employment with Dutch, English, and Portuguese, or Scandinavian companies eager for experienced clerks. A few returned to rural towns, their skills undervalued outside the bustling ports they once served. Despite these hardships, many bookkeepers maintained a deep pride in their craft. Even when wealth and glory escaped them, they recognized that their ledgers preserved the memory of an era, a record of countless voyages, negotiations, and exchanges that defined Northern Europe's medieval economy. Preservation of ledgers and historical memory. Remarkably, many Hanseatic ledgers survived long after the League's political demise. Stored in guild halls, city archives, and private collections, these massive books, some spanning centuries of entries, became invaluable sources for historians. Modern scholars pore over these pages to reconstruct medieval shipping routes, prices of goods, and patterns of cultural exchange. In their quiet durability, these ledgers achieved something few political institutions did. They captured the rhythms of everyday commerce. Long after flags changed and empires rose and fell, the handwriting of forgotten clerks, tight, deliberate, sometimes smudged by candle soot, offers a direct link to a world where trade was measured not by abstract graphs, but by human effort, day after day, entry after entry. Legacy in modern accounting and banking, today's global finance systems, complex corporate balance sheets, stockholder reports, international banking regulations owe a hidden debt to Hanseatic bookkeepers. Double-entry bookkeeping, standardized by Venetian merchants but perfected and widely adopted through Hanseatic trade, remains the backbone of modern accounting. Auditing practices born from guild councils' attempts to maintain trust during decline evolved into formal financial oversight mechanisms. Bills of exchange and early credit systems pioneered by Hanseatic merchants laid groundwork for international banking centuries later. Even in corporate boardrooms of the 21st century, when accountants reconcile ledgers or auditors verify compliance, echoes of those candlelit counting houses persist. The work is faster now, digital and instantaneous, yet fundamentally unchanged. A silent process of ensuring trust in human commerce. The quiet monument. By the time the Hanseatic League officially dissolved in 1862, centuries had passed since its golden age. Its ships were long gone, its military convoys a distant memory. But its influence endured, not through grand monuments or battlefields, but through the ledgers that shaped modern finance. Walking through a museum in Lübeck today, thou might see one of these ancient books on display. Its parchment pages are yellowed and brittle, ink faded, but still legible. There are no illustrations or embellishments, only dense columns of numbers and cryptic abbreviations. Yet this artifact holds the story of an entire civilization of trade, trust, and unseen clerks who labored quietly to keep the machinery of medieval commerce alive. This, perhaps, is the truest legacy of the Hanseatic League. Not a political empire, but a culture of meticulous record-keeping that transformed how humans organize wealth and navigate uncertainty. As you close this chapter of history, you might ask yourself, how many other silent crafts, practiced in obscurity today, will shape the future long after the world has forgotten their names? The art of rope-making in 18th century dockyards. From hemp fields to rope walks, the birth of a vital craft. It is early morning in a quiet English countryside. Mist hangs low over fields lined with tall green stalks of hemp, swaying gently in the breeze. The dew has yet to dry, and farmers move slowly, cutting stalks by hand with curved sickles, their boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. This is the first, humble stage of an unseen but vital industry that will shape the fates of merchant vessels, naval fleets, and dockyard economies in the 18th century. Though history remembers admirals and captains, wars fought at sea, and voyages that spanned oceans, the success of all these ventures relied on something far more mundane: rope. Without strong, flexible, and durable rope, sails could not be hoisted, anchors could not hold, and cargo could not be secured. The art of rope making, hidden in the slow, repetitive toil of field hands, dockyard workers, and rope walk artisans, was as essential to maritime power as cannon fire or ship design. In this section, we trace the earliest stages of rope making, from the hemp fields to the long rope walks of bustling dockyards. We focus not on heroic naval battles, but on the ordinary laborers whose hands twisted fibers into the lifelines of the age of sail. Hemp, the root of maritime strength. In the 18th century, hemp was the primary material for rope making. This hardy plant thrived in varied climates, making it a staple crop across Europe, Russia, and colonial North America. Unlike cotton or flax, hemp's fibers were long and exceptionally strong, resistant to saltwater's corrosive bite. Farmers grew hemp in large fields, sowing seeds closely to encourage tall, straight stalks with fewer branches. Harvesting occurred when the stalks matured, and turned yellowish-brown. Workers, men, women, sowing seeds, and sometimes children. Redding was the next painstaking step. Stalks were soaked in ponds or spread in fields to let dew and natural bacteria break down the plant's outer layers. This could take weeks, and the process was far from pleasant. Redding ponds emitted a pungent, rotting odor that clung to nearby villages. Yet this step was critical. Without proper redding, the fibers would remain coarse and brittle, unsuitable for rope. Once redded, stalks were dried again and brought to breaking mills, where heavy wooden hammers or fluted rollers crushed them to separate woody cores from usable fibers. Women often led this stage, pulling fibers by hand through hackling combs to straighten and clean them. These fibers, long, pale strands resembling golden hair, became the raw foundation of every naval rope, dockyards and rope walks. As Europe's navies and trading companies expanded, the demand for rope exploded. Large dockyards in cities like Portsmouth, Chatham, and Deptford built dedicated rope walks, long, narrow buildings, sometimes stretching over 1,000 feet, where artisans could twist fibers into ropes of immense lengths without interruption. Walking into a rope walk was like stepping into a strange, elongated world. The building was narrow, but astonishingly long, lit by rows of oil lamps or sunlight streaming through high windows. Workers, known as rope makers or ropers, moved steadily along its length, drawing out strands of hemp, combing, spinning, and twisting them in unison. The work was rhythmic and quiet, punctuated only by the creak of wooden wheels and the occasional murmur of instruction. The process began with spinning. Fibers were attached to rotating hooks or whorls, turned by hand or simple treadles. As the hooks spun, workers walked backward down the length of the rope walk, carefully feeding fibers to ensure even twisting. Several smaller strands, called yarns, were then laid together and twisted in the opposite direction to form thicker strands, known as strands or sleighs. Finally, these sleighs were combined into a finished rope, twisted in the opposite direction again to balance tension. This three-stage twist, fiber to yarn, yarn to strand, strand to rope, was crucial. Without it, ropes would unravel under stress, endangering ships and crews. Experienced rope makers judged tension and alignment by sight and touch alone, their fingertips calloused from years of handling rough hemp. The role of rope in naval life. The amount of rope required for a single warship was staggering. A large ship of the line could carry miles of rigging, stays, shrouds, halyards, sheets, and lines of varying thickness. Anchors alone required heavy cables thicker than a man's arm, weighing tons when fully coiled. In the 18th century, the Royal Navy maintained strict standards for rope strength and durability. Rope makers employed by naval dockyards followed detailed specifications for each line. Inspectors tested ropes by stretching them with heavy weights or soaking them in seawater to ensure they would not rot or snap in battle. Failures were costly. Lost sails or broken rigging could doom a ship during a storm or leave it vulnerable to enemy fire. Civilian maritime trade also depended on reliable rope. Merchant ships hauling grain, tobacco, sugar, and textiles across oceans needed ropes for hoisting cargo, securing barrels, and lashing sails during long voyages. Insurance underwriters sometimes refused coverage for ships lacking ropes from reputable rope walks, recognizing the direct link between rope quality and a voyage's success. Life of the rope maker. Rope making was a specialized craft passed down through generations. Apprentices, often boys as young as 12, began by sweeping floors and assisting in hackling hemp. Over years, they learned spinning techniques, the feel of proper tension, and how to judge fiber quality. Journeymen advanced to operating the spinning wheels and eventually became master rope makers, responsible for producing anchor cables and complex rigging lines. The work was physically taxing. Rope makers walked miles each day within the rope walk, spinning fibers while keeping them taut. The air was filled with hemp dust, which coated clothing and irritated lungs. Oil lamps and open hearths made the long wooden buildings vulnerable to fires, a constant threat to workers' safety. Despite these hardships, rope makers took pride in their craft. Ships returning safely from perilous voyages stood as silent testimony to their skill. Economics of rope production. Rope was expensive to produce. Hemp cultivation required labor-intensive farming, and transportation from inland fields to coastal dockyards added costs. Rope walks employed dozens of workers whose wages, though modest, compounded expenses. Finished rope had to be stored in dry warehouses to prevent rot, and constant maintenance was needed to replace worn rigging on active ships. Governments recognized rope as a strategic material. Naval powers stockpiled vast reserves, and some nations offered bounties for hemp cultivation to ensure supplies during wartime. In Britain, laws even forbade the export of certain types of naval rope, treating them as critical to national defense. Economics of rope production. Rope was expensive to produce. Hemp cultivation required labor-intensive farming, and transportation from inland fields to finished rope had to be stored in dry warehouses to prevent rot, and constant maintenance was needed to replace worn rigging on active ships. Governments recognized rope as a strategic material. Naval powers stockpiled vast reserves, and some nations offered bounties for hemp cultivation to ensure supplies during wartime. In Britain, laws even forbade the export of certain types of naval rope, treating them as critical to national defense. As you watch the rope makers moving slowly through the long, candlelit rope walk, twisting fibers into unbroken strands, you may wonder, how did this demanding craft evolve further to meet the growing pressures of global naval warfare and trade in the 18th century's later decades? War, empire, and the rope walks at full stretch. It is now several decades later, and the rope walk you visited in the early morning mist of Section 1 has changed. The building remains long and narrow, still smelling of hemp, pitch, and tallow, but the hum of activity has grown louder. The 18th century has entered a period of near constant naval conflict and colonial expansion. Britain, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic compete for control of sea lanes and far-off territories. Ships of the line, towering floating fortresses bristling with cannons, multiply, and with them, the demand for rope surges to unprecedented levels. The rope walks become busier than ever. Workers labor longer hours, new apprentices flood in, and innovations emerge to keep pace with the staggering needs of global empires at war. Rope as a strategic military resource. Wars in the 18th century were fought not only with muskets and cannon fire, but also with logistics. A ship was a complex machine of wood, canvas, and rope. Rigging had to endure the strain of battle maneuvers, high winds, and the recoil of cannons. Naval battles consumed rope at a tremendous rate. Shattered yards and snapped stays required immediate repairs mid-battle or during stormy passages. Naval planners recognized that fleets were only as strong as their supply of rope. Dockyards stockpiled vast coils of cordage. Admiralties issued strict specifications for anchor cables, standing rigging, which held masts in place, and running rigging, used to adjust sails. A failure in any line could cripple a ship and doom an entire squadron. Because of this, rope walks became almost militarized. Guards patrolled their perimeters during wartime, and laws prevented skilled rope makers from emigrating to espionage, and attempts to poach master rope makers were not uncommon, as each empire sought an advantage in the ceaseless naval arms race. Advancements in rope-making techniques. To meet wartime demand, rope walks expanded and refined their methods. Improvements in spinning wheels allowed for more consistent yarn production. New devices, like capstans and horse-driven laying machines, assisted in twisting larger cables, particularly for anchors that required ropes as thick as a man's thigh. Pitch and tar treatments improved, protecting ropes from saltwater and shipworm damage. Workers brushed hot tar onto completed ropes, infusing them with a dark sheen and distinctive smell that clung to naval decks. This process, though unpleasant for laborers who endured fumes and sticky hands, greatly increased rope longevity during long sea voyages. Some dockyards experimented with mixed fiber ropes, combining hemp with other materials like manila or coir imported from overseas colonies. These exotic fibers offer different strengths and flexibilities, though traditional European hemp remained the standard for critical naval lines. Rope walk life at full capacity. With wars raging across Europe and the Atlantic, rope walks operated near continuously. Master rope makers supervised teams of journeymen and apprentices, working in shifts from dawn until nightfall. The long candlelit halls echoed with the rhythmic creak of spinning hooks and the steady footfalls of men walking backward to twist yarn into strands. The physical demands intensified. Producing the massive anchor cables for warships required teams of rope makers working in precise coordination. Workers carried bundles of hemp weighing hundreds of pounds, their hands blistered and backs stooped. Apprentices hauled finished coils to storage houses, where ropes were stacked high like giant serpents coiled in dim, pitch-scented rooms. Accidents increased with the pace. Spinning hooks could snap under tension, whipping loose fibers into workers' faces. Fires remained an ever-present danger in the dry, flammable halls. Some rope walks introduced strict safety measures: water barrels at intervals, fire watches during night shifts, and stone-lined tar-pitching areas to reduce risk. Economic and social dimensions. The boom in rope production changed local economies. Coastal towns with major dockyards like Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham in Britain, or Brest and Roquefort in France, saw populations swell with artisans, apprentices, and suppliers tied to the rope industry. Rope walks consumed enormous amounts of hemp, driving large-scale cultivation and importation from Russia, Poland, and colonial territories. Wealthy merchants who controlled hemp supply chains grew richer, while common rope makers lived modestly despite their crucial work. Wages remained low, and many families relied on every member, including women and children, to contribute to hemp processing and spinning. The crafts apprenticeship system provided steady, if unglamorous, employment, and generations often followed the same path, binding families to rope walk labor for decades. Rope and the expansion of empire. Rope walks not only supplied European navies, but also fueled colonial expansion. Merchant vessels sailing to India, the Caribbean, and North America depended on robust rigging to withstand long voyages and tropical storms. East India Company ships alone consumed miles of rope for each expedition. Colonial ports eventually developed their own rope-making facilities, often overseen by rope makers sent from Europe to train local workers. These overseas rope walks adapted techniques to local materials, such as manila fibers in the Philippines, blending traditional European methods with new resources. The result was a global rope-making network, linking hemp fields in Eastern Europe to dockyards in London and shipyards in Bengal. Rope became a silent enabler of imperial power, allowing ships to traverse oceans, secure trade goods, and wage wars thousands of miles from home. The human toll. despite technological advances, rope making remained a grueling manual craft. Workers inhaled hemp dust daily, leading to chronic respiratory ailments known as rope maker's lung. Handling tar without proper protection caused skin burns and infections. Blisters, sprains, and muscle strains were part of everyday life. Yet there was little public recognition of these sacrifices. Admirals and ship captains received glory for naval victories, but rope makers rarely saw their names recorded in history books. Still, within dockyard communities, their expertise was respected. A well-made rope was a source of quiet pride, a lifeline for sailors battling gales and enemy broadsides far from shore. Stockpiling and rope maintenance. Rope did not last forever, even when well crafted. Saltwater, strain, and friction wore lines down. Navies employed riggers aboard ships and in dockyards to regularly inspect, replace, and splice ropes. Rope walks supplied not only new cords, but also materials for repairs, sending bundles of yarn and strands for sailors to mend lines at sea. Massive storehouses lined naval yards, filled with coils of spare rigging stacked in orderly rows. These reserves allowed navies to rapidly outfit new ships or repair damaged fleets after battles. Maintaining these stockpiles required continuous effort from rope makers, who could never truly rest while an empire's ships sailed in distant waters. Standing in the midst of a rope walk during this frantic wartime period, you can feel the urgency that pulses through the craft. Every twisted fiber contributes to the might of nations. Yet the workers move slowly and deliberately, ensuring every line is true. And you may begin to wonder, how did the rope-making trade adapt as the century drew to a close, when industrial machinery and changing naval technologies threatened to upend this centuries-old craft? Mechanization, decline of rope walks, and the legacy of handmade naval rope. The century turns slowly toward its end. The long, narrow rope walks that once hummed with footsteps and the creak of spinning hooks now stand quieter than before. Wars have ebbed and flowed. Empires have expanded and contracted. And yet the steady craft of rope-making has endured for generations. But winds of change sweep through the dockyards. Industrialization, with its iron gears and steam power, has arrived to challenge this centuries-old manual labor. The introduction of machinery. The first significant shift came with the invention of rope-making machinery. Simple hand-spinning devices evolved into mechanized systems powered by water wheels or early steam engines. These machines replicated the twisting and laying of fibers that rope makers had performed on foot for centuries, compressing hours of walking and hand-turning into shorter, more efficient operations. In large industrial rope factories, multiple strands could be spun and combined at once. Mechanical hooks, driven by belts and pulleys, turned faster and with more consistent tension than human hands. Factories introduced splicing machines and hot presses for treating ropes with tar and pitch, reducing manual labor and increasing output. This mechanization transformed rope production, allowing thousands of feet of cordage to be made in a fraction of the time. The old image of rope makers walking backward along dimly lit rope walks began to fade, replaced by clattering wheels and the hiss of steam. Impact on dockyard communities. For dockyard workers, the shift was bittersweet. Mechanization promised efficiency, but it also threatened livelihoods built on generations of manual craft. Skilled rope makers who had spent decades mastering tension, twist, and fiber alignment found themselves competing with unskilled labor operating machines. Apprenticeships dwindled as fewer workers were needed to meet growing demands. Some rope walks closed entirely, their once busy halls abandoned. Others converted into mechanized factories, where traditional rope makers supervised mechanical processes rather than walking rope walks with fibers in hand. Communities that had revolved around rope production, families of hemp combers, spinners, and rope makers, faced economic uncertainty. While some adapted to new industrial roles, others migrated to cities, seeking work in unrelated trades as their ancestral craft declined. Naval and commercial rope in the industrial era. Despite these changes, the need for strong, reliable rope did not vanish. The age of sail persisted well into the 19th century, and even as steamships emerged, ropes remained essential for rigging, cargo handling, and anchoring. Mechanized production allowed naval powers to stockpile even greater reserves of cordage, supporting global fleets that dwarfed earlier empires. Commercial shipping also benefited from cheaper, faster rope production, which reduced costs for traders and shipbuilders alike. Yet, many captains and naval riggers still prized ropes made in traditional rope walks, believing that hand-twisted lines offered better strength and durability than early machine-made alternatives. It was not uncommon for prestigious naval vessels to order handmade anchor cables or specialized rigging from master rope makers long after industrialization had taken hold. Colonial and overseas rope making. As empires expanded further, rope making spread globally. Colonial workshops in India, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia combined European methods with local fibers such as Manila hemp and coir. These materials sometimes outperformed European hemp in tropical climates, resisting rot and salt damage more effective. By the mid-19th century, Manila ropes became a major export to Europe and America, gradually replacing traditional hemp in many applications. This global exchange diversified rope materials, but also tied the industry to the broader patterns of colonial exploitation and resource extraction. The slow disappearance of rope walks. By the early 1800s, rope walks had largely given way to factories. The long, narrow buildings, once symbols of dockyard life, stood empty, repurposed for other trades or left to decay. In a few naval yards, particularly those serving older fleets, rope walks remained active, their candlelit interiors unchanged for centuries. These became living relics of an era when every line of cordage was crafted by hand, fiber by fiber. Some surviving rope walks transitioned into hybrid operations, blending handwork with mechanical spinning. In these settings, the craft survived in fragments, carried forward by artisans unwilling to abandon the tactile precision of traditional methods. Cultural memory and modern legacy. Even as rope making modernized, its historical importance was not forgotten. Naval museums preserved rope walk tools, spinning hooks, and massive coils of handmade anchor cables. Maritime painters captured scenes of rope makers walking backward in long wooden halls, only shadows melting into darkness, immortalizing the labor that had sustained empires. Today, a handful of historic rope walks still operate as heritage sites. One of the longest surviving examples can be found in Chatham Dockyard, England. A rope walk stretching over a quarter-mile, where visitors can watch demonstrations of the ancient craft, much as it was practiced in the 18th century. Modern rope production has advanced with synthetic fibers and automated machinery, yet the principles remain unchanged. Fibers twisted to balance tension, strands laid together for strength, rope treated for durability. Techniques honed centuries ago by anonymous rope makers still underpin the lines securing ships, cranes, and industrial machinery around the world. Enduring significance, though largely absent from today's labor force, the old rope makers left a quiet but profound mark on history. Without their craft, the age of sail would have been impossible. Explorations, colonial ventures, and naval wars that shaped modern nations all depended on the unbroken strength of hempen cords. Standing in one of the last traditional rope walks today, you can still feel the weight of that history. The air smells faintly of tar and aged wood. The floorboards creak underfoot, marked by centuries of rope makers pacing back and forth, twisting strands into lines that would hold fast against stow and cannon fire alike. In a world of steam engines and steel ships, the handmade rope seems a relic of a slower, vanished time. Yet, its legacy remains bound tightly to every vessel that sails, every anchor dropped, every line coiled neatly on a dock. The humble rope maker, walking endlessly down a narrow hall, left behind not just rope, but the lifelines of maritime history. Medieval tanning, the slow birth of a leather shoe, from animal hide to raw material, the first steps of leather making. Imagine walking through a medieval town in the early morning, cobblestone streets still damp with dew, the smell of hearth smoke and fresh bread in the air. As you pass the bustling market square and turn down a narrow alleyway, a different smell reaches you. A pungent, sour odor that clings to the wind. This is the unmistakable scent of a tannery. Only shadows melting into darkness. A place where raw animal hides begin their long, laborious transformation into leather, destined for belts, harnesses, armor, and, perhaps most importantly, shoes. This is not a craft for the faint of heart. Tanning in the Middle Ages was one of the most grueling and maligned trades, often relegated to the outskirts of towns because of its stench and waste. Yet without the patient, in this section, we take the first steps into this world, how animal hides were gathered, prepared, and painstakingly converted into raw material suitable for shoemaking. We'll follow the journey from slaughterhouse to tannery pits, through a process so slow and unpleasant that many turned away, yet essential to the survival of everyday medieval life. Gathering hides. The leather-making process began with fresh hides, most often from cattle, but also from sheep, goats, or pigs. In medieval towns, butchers supplied these hides as a byproduct of meat production. Farmers brought slaughtered animals to market, and once the flesh was sold, the hides were left piled outside, sometimes salted or rolled to keep them from rotting before collection. Tanners paid butchers directly for these skins. Since hides were considered waste by many, their value was relatively low. Yet for tanners, this raw material was the foundation of their livelihood. And blemishes of a hide at a glance, selecting only those suitable for durable leather shoes or finer parchment for writing. In rural villages, itinerant tanners traveled from farm to farm, bartering goods or services for hides. In larger towns, official tanner guilds managed this trade, ensuring a steady supply for workshops. The relationship between butcher and tanner was symbiotic, but tinged with rivalry, as butchers sometimes tried to tan hides themselves to capture more profit. Why tanneries smelled so foul? Tanning was an odorous business. Fresh hides, untreated, began to decompose rapidly. To halt this process, tanners first soaked them in vats of lime or fermented solutions that loosened hair and flesh. The mixture's strong, sour stench came from rotting organic matter combined with caustic chemicals. Because of this, medieval town councils often relegated tanneries to riversides outside city walls. Water was essential for soaking, washing, and rinsing hides, and being downwind spared wealthier neighborhoods the smell. Even so, breezes could carry the scent far into town, making tanning synonymous with filth in the medieval imagination. Tanners themselves lived on the margins of society. Despite their vital trade, they were often considered impure due to their constant contact with animal remains and foul-smelling solutions. Some towns even banned tanners from participating in certain civic duties or religious rites. This stigma lingered for centuries, marking tanning as both necessary and undesirable. The liming process. Once collected, hides were taken to the tannery and immediately submerged in lime pits. These were large stone or wooden vats filled with a mixture of water and powdered limestone. The alkaline solution burned away fats and loosened hair from the skin. Workers stirred hides with long wooden poles or waded into pits barefoot, wearing ragged clothing soaked through from repeated exposure. The process took several weeks. Too short a soak, and the hair clung stubbornly to the hide. Too long, and the hide weakened and tore during later stages. Patience was critical. Tanners relied on experience rather than instruments, judging readiness by sight and feel. Once sufficiently limed, hides were dragged out, their surfaces pale and swollen. Workers scraped away remaining hair and flesh using curved knives on wooden beams called horses. This stage, known as fleshing, required skill to avoid damaging the grain of the hide. Piles of discarded hair and fat built up near the tannery, adding to its reputation for filth. Dot. De-liming and baiting. After liming, hides needed to be softened and prepared for actual tanning. Left too alkaline, they would resist absorbing tannins later on. Tanners rinsed them repeatedly in running water, sometimes in rivers, to remove excess lime. Then came the bait, a mixture of fermented animal dung and enzymes applied to hides to relax fibers and make them supple. This step was notoriously foul-smelling. Workers stomped hides in bait pits, much like grapes in winemaking, kneading dung and solution into the material. Though disgusting, this process was essential to creating pliable leather. Without it, the final product would crack and stiffen, useless for making comfortable shoes. Early soaking in tannins. Before full tanning, hides were soaked in weak solutions of tannin-rich substances, bark from oak or chestnut trees, galls, or certain roots. These plant materials contained tannic acid, a natural preservative that began binding with the proteins in the medieval tanners spent considerable time gathering and grinding bark into fine powder. Entire forests supported this trade, with bark stripped from felled trees and hauled to tanneries by wagon. This pre-tanning soak could last weeks, gradually transforming the hides from raw flesh to a substance resistant to rot. From raw material to crafting leather shoes. By the end of this early process, hides had been limed, fleshed, baited, and soaked in tannins. They were now considered raw tanned leather, stiff and thick, but preserved. To become supple enough for shoes, they would need further tanning in stronger solutions, stretching, and finally cutting and sewing by cobblers. A slow journey that could take months, from slaughter to finished footwear. Even in this early stage, the work demanded resilience. Tanners stood knee-deep in foul-smelling pits, scraped hides for hours, and endured the judgment of townsfolk who saw them as necessary outcasts. Yet, without their labor, medieval society would lack durable footwear, armor, saddles, and countless everyday goods. As you watch these first steps unfold, the tanneries stink clinging to your imagination. You may wonder, how did medieval tanners refine this grueling process to produce high-quality leather for the growing demands of towns, armies, and long-distance trade? The full tanning process, leather guilds, and crafting durable shoe leather. The raw tanned hides rest in piles, pale and stiff, their journey from slaughterhouse to raw leather complete. Yet this is only halfway through the transformation. To create supple, long-lasting leather, suitable for shoes, belts, or armor, medieval tanners had to continue a process, both meticulous and painfully slow. As towns expanded and trade routes connected distant regions, the demand for high-quality leather soared. Shoemakers, saddlers, and armorers depended on consistent, strong hides. Meeting this demand required refining tanning methods, regulating quality through guilds, and ensuring every hide was treated with precision and care. Strong tanning baths. After initial preparation, hides were placed into deeper tanning pits filled with concentrated tannin solutions made from oak or chestnut bark. Unlike the early weak soaks, these baths could be so potent they stained workers' skin and nails dark brown. Tanners layered hides in large wooden vats or stone-lined pits, sprinkling powdered bark between each layer before adding water. The hides were left to steep for months, sometimes over a year, for the thickest leathers used in soles and armor. Periodically, workers turned the hides, ensuring even penetration of tannins. The tannins worked slowly, binding to collagen fibers in the skin and transforming them into durable leather. This chemical process preserved the material against decay, water damage, and insects. The longer the soak, the stronger and more resilient the leather became. For shoemakers who needed leather flexible enough to bend, yet firm enough to withstand walking, proper tanning was critical. Stretching and drying. Once tanned, hides were pulled from pits. Heavy and soaked through, workers used simple wooden winches or sheer brute strength to hoist them out, dripping with dark liquid. They were then stretched on frames called stretching horses or pegged to ground boards under the sun. Stretching helped maintain the leather's shape, preventing warping as it dried. Tanners scraped away excess bark residue and evened out thickness using curved knives. For shoe leather, achieving uniform thickness was drying took weeks, sometimes months, depending on weather. Rain could spoil drying hides, so tanners carefully monitored skies, covering frames with oiled cloth or moving them under sheds when storms threatened. This slow patience marked every step of medieval tanning. There were no shortcuts without sacrificing quality. Oiling and softening. Even after months in tannin baths, leather remained stiff. To make it pliable for shoes or clothing, tanners rubbed it with animal fats. Oils or beeswax. Workers kneaded hides by hand, rolling and bending them repeatedly to work oils deep into the fibers. This stage required skill and strength. Too much oil could make leather greasy and weak. Too little left it brittle. Experienced tanners judged softness by feel, folding hides to see if they creased cleanly or cracked under pressure. Softened hides were stacked and left to rest, allowing oils to settle evenly. For luxury shoes or fine garments, additional treatments, such as dyeing with natural pigments or applying decorative finishes, were performed. But most everyday leatherwork focused simply on durability and flexibility, gilds, and quality control. As towns grew wealthier during the High Middle Ages, leather became a commodity requiring regulation. Tanneries proliferated and competition intensified. To ensure consistent standards, tanning and shoemaking guilds emerged, powerful organizations controlling every aspect of leather production and sale. Guilds inspected hides at various stages, punishing dishonest tanners who cut corners or used inferior materials. They set rules for hide sourcing, tanning times, and pit construction. Only those trained and approved by guilds could legally sell leather or leather goods within town markets. Becoming a master tanner required years of apprenticeship, learning each stage of the process under strict supervision. Guild membership granted the right to operate a tannery within city limits, access to bulk bark supplies, and protection against unfair competition. For shoemakers, guilds ensured they received leather that could endure months or years of wear. Poorly tanned hides not only damaged reputations, but also posed risks to travelers and soldiers who relied on strong footwear. Trade and transport. Tanning was rarely done close to shoe workshops. Instead, large tanneries operated near riversides, outside towns, exporting finished leather to markets across Europe. Merchants bundled hides into bales, transporting them by cart or boat to urban centers, where cobblers transformed them into shoes. International trade routes connected Mediterranean leather, known for its softness and fine quality, with Northern Europe, where thicker hides were preferred for boots and armor. Guild seals stamped onto hides guaranteed their origin and authenticity. Leather became a major commodity, second only to textiles in some regions. Wars, pilgrimages, and expanding trade networks increased demand for durable shoes, harnesses, and travel gear. Medieval society's mobility, whether on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela or on campaign during the Crusades, relied on the work of unseen tanners laboring in foul-smelling pits far from city centers. From tanner to cobbler, by the time leather reached a shoemaker's bench, it had undergone a transformation spanning many months. What began as raw, decaying hide had become strong, supple, and ready to be cut and stitched. Cobblers measured and sliced leather into patterns for uppers, soles, and straps. Heavy sole leather was often double-layered and nailed or stitched, while softer leather formed the shoe's top. Medieval shoes, though simple in design compared to modern footwear, owed their durability entirely to meticulous tanning. A single pair might last years, handed down or repaired multiple, before finally wearing out. Life of the tanner. While guild membership offered some security, tanning remained physically punishing. Workers slogged through vats, scraped hides for hours, and endured constant exposure to chemicals that burned skin and caused sores. The smell clung to clothing and hair, marking tanners even when away from work. Despite social stigma, many families remained in tanning for generations. Skilled tanners took pride in oiled material and shape it into footwear tailored to a world of pilgrimage, travel, and daily survival. Cobblers, shoemaking guilds, and the final birth of a medieval shoe. By the time leather left the tannery's vats, it was transformed, strong, darkened, and richly scented with oils and tannins. Months of labor, soaking, scraping, and stretching had produced material ready for the hands of another kind of craftsman, the cobbler or shoemaker. These artisans, often working in cramped workshops within bustling medieval towns, gave leather its final shape, turning hardened hides into durable shoes, essential for everyday life. This concluding section follows the leather from the tannery to the shoemaker's bench, detailing the painstaking process of crafting medieval footwear, the role of shoemaking guilds, and the life of cobblers who ensured that peasants, pilgrims, and the shoemaker's workshop. Stepping inside a medieval shoemaker's shop, you would see a small, dimly lit space, likely part of the artisan's home. The air smells of leather, beeswax, and wood shavings. A low table holds tools of the trade, wooden lasts, forms shaped like human feet, sharp knives, awls, hammers, and needles threaded with sturdy flax cord. Shoemakers received thick sole leather and softer upper leather from tanners. Before cutting, they inspected every piece, running calloused fingers along the grain, checking for imperfections or uneven thickness. Unlike modern mass production, every shoe was hand-measured and custom-fitted, whether for a noble's fine boots or a farmer's heavy work shoes. Patterns and cutting. The process began with making patterns from parchment or scrap leather. Shoemakers traced outlines of feet or used standard sizes developed through experience. Patterns for soles, uppers, and straps were laid out on leather pieces to minimize waste and import consideration, since leather was costly despite its smelly origins. Using sharp knives, shoemakers cut along patterns, taking care to preserve the integrity of the grain. Mistakes meant starting over or patching with scraps, risking a weaker shoe. The thick sole leather required extra strength to cut, while softer upper leather could be shaped more easily. Assembling the shoe. Once cut, pieces were stitched together using awls to pierce holes and waxed flax thread for durability. For turn shoes, the most common medieval footwear, shoemakers stitched uppers inside out to the sole, then soaked and turned them right side out, hiding seams for comfort and better protection against wear. Other designs, such as boots or pattens, wooden overshoes, involved layering leather soles or attaching straps and buckles. Every stitch was made by hand, and alignment had to be precise to prevent seams from pulling apart, hammering them flush to avoid discomfort. shaping and lasting. To shape shoes properly, cobblers stretched damp leather over wooden lasts. These forms, carved to different sizes and shapes, allowed artisans to mold footwear that conformed to the foot's contours. Once fitted and dried, leather retained its shape, ensuring a snug but comfortable fit. Finishing touches included trimming excess leather, smoothing seams with pumice or files, and adding decorative elements for wealthier clients. Nobles might commission pointed toes or colored dyes, while peasants received plain, sturdy designs meant for fieldwork and long journeys. Soles and durability. Medieval roads were rough, often muddy or strewn with stones. To withstand such conditions, shoemakers thickened soles by stacking leather layers and reinforcing them with hobnails, small iron studs hammered into the bottom. These nails provided traction and slowed wear, though they made shoes heavier. Cobblers also used pitch or resin to waterproof seams and soles. Shoes were frequently repaired. Worn soles replaced, torn uppers patched, and stitching redone. A well-made shoe might last years with proper maintenance, handed down or resold in second-hand markets. Guilds and regulation. Like tanners, shoemakers organized into guilds that set standards for craftsmanship and fair trade. Guild rules specified acceptable leather types, stitching methods, and pricing, ensuring buyers received durable products. Only approved members could sell shoes in town markets, protecting customers from poor quality or fraudulent goods. Becoming a master shoemaker required years of apprenticeship under a skilled cobbler. Apprentices learned every stage of the craft, from pattern making to sewing and lasting, before producing a masterpiece shoe judged by guild elders. Passing this test granted permission. Guilds also defended their trade against foreign imports or rival towns, lobbying city councils to enforce exclusive rights within their jurisdictions. This control kept shoemaking a respected, stable profession that could support entire families. Shoes for every walk of life. Shoes reflected social class and occupation. Peasants wore low-cut leather shoes or boots, suited for farm work. Pilgrims donned sturdy walking boots, reinforced for long journeys to holy sites. Soldiers had heavier footwear, adapted for marching and battle. Nobles and royalty commissioned elaborate boots or decorative slippers dyed in rich colors and sometimes embroidered with silk threads. Despite these variations, the fundamental design remained simple. Leather soles stitched to flexible uppers, shaped on wooden lasts. Comfort was secondary to durability, and shoes often molded to the wearer's feet over time, rather than fitting perfectly from the start. The final step, a walking legacy. When a finished pair of shoes left the cobbler's bench, it carried with it months of labor and skill. Behind its modest appearance lay the work of farmers raising cattle, butchers supplying hides, tanners enduring noxious pits, and shoemakers cutting, stitching, and lasting by candlelight. The act of walking through a medieval town, whether across muddy alleys, wooden bridges, or stone church floors, depended on this unseen chain of hands. Without durable shoes, pilgrims could not complete their journeys, armies could not march, and townsfolk could not endure daily toil. Even as centuries passed and shoemaking evolved with new tools and techniques, the slow birth of a medieval shoe remained a testament to resilience. Each step taken in those leather soles echoed with the toil of nameless artisans who transformed raw hide into essential protection for human travel and survival. As you watch a cobbler place the final stitches, trimming threads and setting a pair of shoes by the fire to dry, you might wonder how many countless journeys from village lanes to distant crusades depended on this quiet craft, often overlooked, yet indispensable to medieval life.